In the smoky streets of Boston, long before independence was declared, the spark of revolution was lit, not by generals or politicians, but by ordinary men and women who had had enough. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, who had escaped enslavement and carved out a life as a sailor and laborer. On a cold night in March 1770, when tensions between British soldiers and angry colonists erupted, Attucks stood at the center of the crowd. Accounts differ on who threw the first object or shouted the first threat, but when muskets roared, Attucks fell, struck twice, his blood staining the cobblestones. He was the first to die in what became known as the Boston Massacre. For some, he became a martyr for liberty. For others, he was an inconvenient symbol, a black man at the very foundation of America's struggle for freedom. His story would echo, but it was far from unique. As the colonies moved closer to war with Britain, men of African descent, both free and enslaved, were caught in a dilemma that carried life or death consequences. Who truly held the key to their freedom? The colonists demanding independence, or the British crown promising emancipation for those who would take up arms against the rebels? Thousands of men weighed this choice, and their decisions would reshape the struggle and the nation itself. Some would fight with Washington's Continental Army, blending into ranks that rarely recorded their names. Others would take up the king's cause, believing British promises of liberty were more likely to be honored than the colonists' words about equality. In the Revolution's earliest days, George Washington himself resisted the idea of black men serving in the army. He worried it would disrupt the social order, that armed black men would strike fear into colonists who already lived with the paranoia of slave uprisings. But desperation has a way of rewriting rules. As the war dragged on and recruits dwindled, Washington reversed his stance. Soon, black soldiers were fighting in some of the most critical battles of the Revolution, from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. Many of these men fought in integrated units, rare for the time, standing shoulder to shoulder with white colonists. For the briefest of moments, the dream of equality flickered, visible on the battlefield, even if absent in law. But not all found their hope in the Continental lines. Across the South, enslaved men heard the words of Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, who in 1775 declared that any enslaved person who fled their rebel masters and joined the British forces would be granted freedom. For thousands, this was the first official promise of liberation they had ever heard, and they seized it. Families were torn apart as men escaped plantations to fight in red coats, forming what became known as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. They fought fiercely, not for king or crown, but for a chance to live free. This conflict within the conflict, black men fighting on both sides, each hoping for liberty, defined the Revolution in ways often overlooked. It was not simply a war of colonists versus empire, but a war that forced African Americans to gamble on which side might deliver them a future beyond bondage. That gamble was cruel, for many promises of freedom went unfulfilled. British commanders evacuated thousands of formerly enslaved men and their families after the war, transporting them to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, and even back to Africa. But countless others were betrayed, returned to slavery, despite the vows that had drawn them to fight. In the new United States, those who had shed blood for independence were often cast back into chains, their contributions erased from the triumphant story of liberty. And yet, despite betrayal, their impact cannot be denied. The Revolution created the first wave of African American veterans, men who had seen battle, who had fought with courage, and who would carry both pride and disillusionment into the new republic. Their very presence posed a question the fledgling nation could not answer. How could a country built on liberty deny it to those who had bled for its birth? The Revolution was only the beginning. The contradiction of freedom and slavery would fester, widening with every generation. And when the nation was once again torn apart in civil war, Black soldiers would return to the battlefield, not as an afterthought, but as a decisive force that shaped the outcome of the struggle. In the opening battles of the Revolution, black men were not merely present, they were indispensable. At Bunker Hill in 1775, as British forces advanced up the slopes, under a hail of musket fire, one of the men holding the line was Peter Salem, a formerly enslaved man who had won his freedom by enlisting. He fired calmly into the advancing redcoats, and according to accounts, it was his shot that killed Major John Pitcairn, a key British officer. Salem's bravery was remembered in paintings and ballads of the time, though his name quickly faded from the mainstream narrative. Like so many black patriots, he stood in the shadows of history, his sacrifice celebrated only when convenient. Salem was not alone. Salem Poor, another black soldier at Bunker Hill, fought with such distinction that 14 white officers petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to honor him for his gallant and brave behavior. Their testimony declared him a hero. Yet Poor, like so many others, returned to a life of poverty and obscurity once the guns fell silent. These stories reveal both the promise and betrayal at the heart of the Revolution. On the battlefield, black soldiers could prove their valor. Offutt society refused to grant them lasting recognition. In Rhode Island, desperation for soldiers led to one of the most remarkable military experiments of the war. In 1778, the Rhode Island Assembly voted to allow enslaved men to enlist in exchange for their freedom. Their masters would be compensated, and the men themselves would be emancipated upon service. Thus was born the first Rhode Island Regiment, a unit that became one of the most diverse forces of the Revolution, composed of free black men, Native Americans, and whites fighting side by side. On the battlefield at the Battle of Newport, they repelled wave after wave of Hessian mercenaries, holding the line with ferocity. For those who witnessed it, the regiment proved that courage knew no color. But the regiment also highlighted the contradictions of the American cause. While these men fought for liberty, their brothers and sisters remained in bondage. Freedom was not extended to all who fought. It was selective, conditional, transactional. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment disbanded after the war, and many veterans struggled to claim the rights they had been promised. Yet their service carved a permanent mark, demonstrating that the ideals of the Revolution could not be separated from the demand for black freedom. Beyond New England, other African Americans took up arms in less visible but equally critical ways. James Armistead, an enslaved man in Virginia, offered his service as a spy for the Marquis de Lafayette. Slipping into British camps, he gathered intelligence that proved decisive in the lead-up to Yorktown. It was Armistead's reports that revealed British troop movements and supply weaknesses, intelligence that helped secure the American victory. After the war, Lafayette personally advocated for his freedom, and Armistead, adopting Lafayette's name, lived out his life as James Armistead Lafayette, a man who had helped topple an empire with cunning rather than musket fire. Women, too, contributed in ways often left unrecorded. African American women carried messages, cooked for troops, and nursed the wounded. Some disguised themselves to follow loved ones into battle, their stories lost in the shadows of a war that seldom acknowledged them. Their labor, like that of their male counterparts, sustained the fight for independence, even as the promise of that independence excluded them. By the end of the Revolution, historians estimate that between 5,000 and 9,000 black men had fought for the Continental cause. Thousands more had fought for the British, drawn by promises of liberty that often proved hollow. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, marking the official end of the war, the irony was staggering. A nation birthed in the language of freedom continued to hold hundreds of thousands of African Americans in bondage. Yet the war left a crack in the edifice of slavery. It had proven, beyond question, that black men could fight with skill, discipline, and courage equal to any white soldier. It had exposed the hypocrisy of a republic that proclaimed liberty while denying it, and it had planted seeds of expectation, seeds that would sprout in the generations to come. The revolution did not end slavery, but it ignited a conversation that could not be extinguished. Black veterans returned to their homes, determined to claim the dignity they had earned, whether or not the new nation recognized it. They told their stories, raised their children with pride, and became symbols of possibility in a land that tried to erase them. Their presence alone was a challenge, a reminder that America's promise was unfinished. And as the 19th century dawned, those unfinished promises grew heavier. For every man who had fought for liberty and been returned to bondage, for every family split by war and betrayal, the gap between America's ideals and its reality widened. That gap would not close with time. It would erupt, violently, in the greatest conflict the young nation would ever face. In the years after the Revolution, Black veterans returned home, expecting their service to mean something: respect, recognition, perhaps even equality. What they found instead was silence. The nation they had helped to win treated them no differently than before, often worse. Promises made on the battlefield evaporated in the halls of government. Many who had been promised freedom were denied it, their petitions ignored, their sacrifices forgotten. For men who had faced musket fire for liberty, the betrayal was bitter. Some, like Salem Poor and Peter Salem, slipped into obscurity, living out their lives in poverty. Others, like James Armistead Lafayette, were fortunate enough to secure freedom and a measure of security. But even for those who did win liberty, opportunities remained scarce. Employment, land ownership, and political rights were tightly restricted, and white society showed little interest in honoring their contributions. Black veterans became living contradictions, walking reminders of a revolution that preached equality but practiced exclusion. Yet their stories did not vanish entirely. In black churches, in small communities, in whispered traditions passed down through families, the memory of their bravery lived on. These men became symbols, not just of what was, but of what could be. Their presence in the Revolution was proof that African Americans had a rightful place in the nation's story, no matter how hard the mainstream tried to erase them. In this way, the veterans carried not only their own dignity, but the hopes of generations to come. The years after independence saw slavery expand, not retreat. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 supercharged the plantation economy, turning cotton into America's white gold. Where the Revolution had cracked open the question of slavery, the new economy slammed it shut. Enslaved men and women were chained deeper into a system that grew more profitable by the year. To many in power, the contributions of black soldiers in the Revolution were not an inspiration, but a danger, proof that black men could fight, lead, and imagine freedom. That knowledge terrified a society built on keeping them in bondage. And yet, the flame of liberty refused to die. Among free black communities in the North, veterans and their descendants organized schools, churches, and civic groups. They spoke of the Revolution not as a closed chapter, but as unfinished business. They petitioned courts for land, for pensions, for recognition of service. Some wrote their experiences, leaving rare first-hand accounts that testified to both their bravery, their frustration. These voices, faint but persistent, became the roots of a new struggle, one that would eventually flower into abolitionist movements. The War of 1812 offered another opportunity for black men to prove their worth in battle. In cities like New Orleans, free black militias formed to defend the United States against British invasion. General Andrew Jackson, who would later become infamous for his policies against Native Americans, praised the courage of these men when they helped secure victory at the Battle of New Orleans. But as soon as peace returned, their service was quickly forgotten. their status reduced once more to second-class citizens. This pattern, valor in war, erasure in peace, became a grim cycle. Each generation of African Americans offered their blood for a nation that refused to see them as equals. But with every war, with every act of courage, the hypocrisy of the Republic became harder to deny. The questions raised by the Revolution never went away. They lingered, haunting the conscience of the nation. By the mid-1910th century, those questions could no longer be ignored. The expansion of slavery westward, the fierce debates over free and slave states, and the growing abolitionist movement all pointed toward a reckoning. Black veterans of the Revolution had long passed, but their example endured. Their sacrifices became a precedent, a reminder that African Americans had been part of the fight for liberty from the very beginning. And when the Civil War erupted, their descendants would once again take up arms, not as shadows in the background, but as a force that would change the course of the nation. When the first shots of the Civil War rang out at Fort Sumter in 1861, the question of black participation in the conflict was immediate. African Americans knew what was at stake. For them, the war was not simply about preserving the Union. It was about ending the institution that had defined their lives for centuries. Freedom was no longer an abstract idea. It was a cause worth seizing with both hands. At the beginning, though the Union was reluctant to accept black soldiers, President Abraham Lincoln framed the war as a fight to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. Many Northern leaders feared that arming black men would alienate the border states, still wavering between Union and Confederacy. Even among white Northerners who opposed slavery, racism ran deep. They doubted black men's ability to fight, questioned their discipline, and worried about how white soldiers would respond to sharing ranks. But African Americans did not wait for permission. From the war's earliest days, they pressed to join the fight. Free men in the North volunteered their services, while enslaved men in the South fled plantations to reach Union lines, offering their labor, intelligence, and eventually their lives. They built fortifications, carried supplies, and worked as scouts. In every way they could, they pushed themselves into the struggle for freedom, forcing the Union to reckon with their determination. The turning point came in 1862. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the Union's need for manpower grew desperate. That same year, Congress passed the Militia Act, which authorized the enlistment of African Americans in military service. Soon after, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a crusade against slavery. Now, for the first time, black men could officially wear Union blue and fight for their freedom. Their enlistment was not just symbolic, it was strategic. The Confederacy's strength depended on the labor of millions of enslaved people. Every man who escaped weakened the Southern economy, and every man who picked up a rifle for the Union tilted the balance of power. Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist, called the moment historic. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., he declared, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. The first black regiments began to form, often under white officers. Among the most famous was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, composed largely of free black men from the North. The 54th would go on to prove itself in one of the war's bloodiest assaults, shattering doubts about black soldiers' courage. But before they reached the battlefield, they endured unequal pay, poor equipment, and constant suspicion from both enemies and allies. Even so, the floodgates had opened. By the war's end, nearly 200,000 African American men would serve in the Union Army and Navy. Their presence reshaped the conflict, turning it into a fight, not just for a union of states, but for a new birth of freedom. In July of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment marched into history. Their target was Fort Wagner, a heavily fortified Confederate stronghold guarding the approach to Charleston, South Carolina. The men of the 54th knew the odds were against them. They would be leading the assault, charging headlong into cannon fire, rifles, and sharpened bayonets. For many, it would be their first true battle, and perhaps their last. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, their young commander, rode at the front, but it was the men behind him who bore the weight of history. They were free black men, laborers, farmers, artisans, men who had endured scorn even in the North. For months they had drilled, trained, and prepared, determined to prove to the nation that black soldiers were not only capable of fighting, but of dying for the same cause as any white man. As the sun set on July 18th, the regiment advanced. Confederate cannons roared, tearing through the ranks. Still they pressed forward, shouting, charging across the beach toward the towering walls of the fort. Sergeant William H. Kearny, one of the regiment's color bearers, saw the American flag begin to fall as Shaw was struck down. Through smoke and fire, Kearny seized the flag and carried it forward, planting it on the parapet. Wounded multiple times, he refused to let it touch the ground, crawling back with the flag still in his hands. His courage earned him the Medal of Honor, making him one of the first African Americans to receive the nation's highest military award. The assault on Fort Wagner ended in devastating loss. Nearly half the regiment was killed, wounded, or captured, including Colonel Shaw, who was buried in a mass grave alongside his men. But though the 54th failed to take the fort, they achieved something far greater. Their bravery silenced critics who doubted the fighting spirit of black troops. Newspapers across the North hailed their heroism, and recruitment of African Americans surged. The 54th had transformed public perception, not just of the war, but of what freedom meant. Their stand at Fort Wagner became a symbol, immortalized in songs, paintings, and later the film Glory. For African Americans, it was proof that their blood was part of the nation's soil, their sacrifices inseparable from its survival. For the Union, it was a turning point. From that moment, no one could deny that black soldiers were essential to victory. But the story of the 54th was not unique. Across the South, in battles big and small, black regiments fought with the same resolve. From the Louisiana Native Guard to the United States colored troops in Virginia, they endured harsher conditions, faced greater dangers if captured, and still pressed forward. Fort Wagner was just the most visible example of a truth that echoed across the battlefields. Liberty would not be handed down, it would be taken, with courage and sacrifice. After Fort Wagner, the door was fully open. The creation of the United States Colored Troops, known as the USCT, formalized what had already begun, the enlistment of black men on a massive scale. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 African American soldiers served in the Union Army, with another 20,000 in the Navy. In total, 1 out of every 10 Union soldiers was black. The USCT was not a single regiment, but hundreds, spread across the states, numbering over 160 separate units. Some were composed of free black men from northern states. Others were filled with formerly enslaved men who had fled plantations and seized the chance to fight for their own liberation. To enlist was to take a stand against slavery, not just in principle, but in person. These men risked everything, their lives, their families, their fragile freedom, for the hope of a nation that had never fully recognized them. On the battlefield, the USCT quickly proved indispensable. They fought at Port Hudson, Milliken's Bend, and Fort Pillow. They stormed entrenchments, held defensive lines, and often bore the brunt of the most dangerous assignments. Their determination was fueled by more than patriotism. It was fueled by the knowledge that defeat meant chains, and victory meant the possibility of freedom. But their service carried unique risks. Unlike white soldiers, black troops faced brutal consequences if captured. The Confederacy often refused to treat them as prisoners of war, instead executing them or selling them back into bondage. At Fort Pillow in 1864, Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest slaughtered surrendering black troops in what became known as the Fort Pillow Massacre. The atrocity sent shockwaves through the Union, galvanizing African American soldiers to fight with even greater resolve, knowing mercy was rarely an option. Despite the dangers, their courage never wavered. At Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, newly recruited black soldiers, many still raw, barely trained, stood their ground against seasoned Confederate troops. With bayonets and sheer determination, they drove the enemy back. White officers, who had doubted them, were stunned, acknowledging that these men had fought with a fierceness born of desperation and hope. The USCT also played critical roles off the battlefield. They guarded supply lines, built fortifications, and secured occupied territories. In southern towns, their presence was a symbol of freedom itself. Formerly enslaved men now marched through the same streets where they had once been shackled, rifles on their shoulders, uniforms on their backs, embodying a future that had seemed impossible only years before. Even President Lincoln recognized their impact. By 1864, he openly declared that the Union could not win without the contributions of black soldiers. Their service was not only reshaping the war, it was reshaping the meaning of America. The fight was no longer just about reuniting states. It was about redefining freedom, citizenship, and who could claim ownership of the American experiment. By 1864, the presence of black soldiers was no longer a novelty. It was a force reshaping the Union war effort and the nation itself. Their contributions were undeniable, yet they continued to face systemic discrimination within the very army they were saving. Pay was one of the starkest examples. While white soldiers earned $13 a month plus clothing allowances, black troops were initially offered only $10, with $3 automatically deducted for clothing. The insult was clear: their lives were valued less, even as they bled and died in the same battles. The outcry was immediate. Black regiments and their allies protested, refusing pay until equality was granted. Men of the 54th Massachusetts famously went months without wages rather than accept unequal treatment. Their stand forced Congress to act, and by mid-1864, pay for black soldiers was equalized, retroactive to the beginning of their service. It was a victory not just of policy, but of principle, a demonstration that dignity could not be separated from duty. Racism in the ranks went far beyond pay. Black soldiers were often denied promotions, kept under white officers, and assigned the most grueling labor jobs. Yet they endured, determined to prove themselves through action. An action they saw from the swamps of Louisiana to the trenches of Petersburg. With every battle, with every sacrifice, they chipped away at the racist myth that had justified slavery for generations. Politically, their service began to transform the nation. Abraham Lincoln, who had once been cautious about abolition, grew more committed as he witnessed the impact of black troops. In conversations and speeches, he acknowledged their essential role, noting that without them, the Union might not survive. Their presence on the battlefield strengthened the hand of abolitionists in Congress, pushing the nation toward the passage of the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery once and for all. For the Confederacy, the sight of armed black men in Union blue was more than a military threat. It was a psychological one. Each rifle, carried by a former bondman, struck fear into a system built on subjugation. Every skirmish was a reminder that the institution of slavery was unraveling, not just politically, but physically, by the very people it had tried to dehumanize. In southern towns, when black regiments marched through, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Enslaved men and women watched from the roadsides as soldiers, men who looked like them, strode with rifles and bayonets, their uniforms gleaming. For some, it was the first tangible sign that freedom was coming. Songs, prayers, and celebrations erupted in their wake. For Confederate loyalists, it was humiliation, a reversal of the world they thought eternal. The presence of these soldiers was not just about winning battles, it was about rewriting the meaning of the war itself. The Union was no longer fighting merely to preserve itself, it was fighting to redefine who belonged within it. With every step, every bullet, every act of defiance against unequal treatment, black soldiers were laying the groundwork for a new vision of America, one where citizenship and liberty could not be tied to color. By the final years of the war, black soldiers were no longer on the margins of the fight. They were at the heart of the Union's push to crush the Confederacy. At Petersburg, Virginia, in 1864, thousands of black troops dug trenches, hauled supplies, and fought in brutal assaults that tested the endurance of every man. The siege stretched for nearly 10 months, and it was in this grinding war of attrition that the contributions of black regiments became impossible to ignore. One of the most infamous episodes was the Battle of the Crater. Union forces detonated a massive mine beneath Confederate lines, creating a deadly gap in their defenses. But poor leadership squandered the chance for a breakthrough. Black soldiers, who had trained extensively for the assault, were held back at the last minute by commanders, fearful of criticism if the attack failed. When they were finally ordered forward into the chaos, they charged with courage, but met slaughter in the pit of smoke, fire, and tangled bodies. Their bravery could not overcome the mistakes of the men who led them. At Nashville, in late 1864, black regiments helped deliver a decisive blow against Confederate General John Bell Hood's army. In coordinated assaults, they stormed enemy fortifications, taking fire yet pressing forward with relentless determination. Observers noted their discipline, their ferocity, their refusal to be driven back. These victories proved that black troops were not merely filling numbers, they were shattering Confederate lines, helping to tilt the balance of the war. Even in smaller battles and skirmishes across the South, their presence carried symbolic weight. In Louisiana, black troops fought at Port Hudson, holding their ground under merciless fire. In South Carolina, they struck Confederate positions along the coast, disrupting supply lines and weakening the enemy's grip. Each of these actions chipped away at the Confederacy's capacity to fight, while also demonstrating that enslaved people had become the agents of their own liberation. The battlefield was not just about military success, it was about visibility, about rewriting the story of who America's defenders were. White soldiers who had once doubted them began to admit their value. Northern newspapers that had mocked the idea of black men fighting now published accounts of their valor. And in Southern communities, their victories sent shockwaves through the population, signaling that the Confederacy was crumbling, not just from without, but from within. By the end of 1864, as the Union tightened its grip, it was clear black soldiers were indispensable. They had fought in hundreds of engagements, endured immense losses, and proven beyond doubt that they were as capable, as disciplined, and as brave as any other soldiers in the field. The war's outcome was still uncertain, but one truth was fixed. America could no longer deny the price black men had paid for freedom, nor the role they played in securing it. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy was collapsing under the weight of defeat. Union armies advanced deeper into the South, and with them came the sight of black soldiers in blue uniforms, marching through once enslaved lands. To white Southerners, it was a nightmare come to life. The people they had held in bondage now returned as armed liberators, carrying rifles, wearing Union insignia, and backed by the might of the Federal Army. In Virginia, the Army of the James included thousands of black troops who played a pivotal role in the final campaigns. At the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, black regiments entered the burning city, securing streets and protecting civilians. For many formerly enslaved men, this was a moment of transformation. They were no longer property, they were soldiers, marching proudly into the very heart of the rebellion that had sought to deny their humanity. Elsewhere, in states like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Black troops accompanied Sherman's march. Their presence was more than symbolic, it was strategic. They guarded supply lines, engaged Confederate skirmishers, and brought order to territories shaken by destruction. To the thousands of enslaved people they encountered, the sight of black soldiers offered a vision of freedom and a promise of a different future. Confederates, however, reacted with rage. Propaganda painted black soldiers as a threat, stirring fear among white civilians. In some cases, Confederate forces committed atrocities against captured black troops, refusing them the protections given to white prisoners of war. Yet despite this brutal reality, the resolve of black regiments only deepened. Every march, every battle, every victory became both military service and a form of resistance against centuries of oppression. The symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. Northern leaders saw the political implications clearly. Abraham Lincoln himself acknowledged that without the nearly 200,000 black men who fought, the Union might not have survived. Their contribution was not an afterthought, it was decisive. As Union forces pressed on, and Confederate hopes dwindled, the role of black soldiers was impossible to erase. And so, as the Confederacy neared its end, the image of black troops in uniform became one of the most powerful sights of the Civil War. They represented both vengeance and justice, both the destruction of slavery and the birth of a new America. For the men themselves, the war was more than victory on the battlefield. It was proof that they had claimed their place in the nation's story, not as subjects of bondage, but as architects of freedom. When the guns finally fell silent in April 1865, freedom was no longer a dream whispered in slave quarters. It was the law of the land. The Emancipation Proclamation had already declared freedom for those in Confederate states, but with Union victory, the institution of slavery itself was shattered. For the men who had fought in blue uniforms, the war's end carried a deep personal meaning. They had not only witnessed the destruction of slavery, they had helped bring it about, with their own hands, their own sacrifices. Yet victory was complicated. The promise of freedom was immediate, but the promise of equality was not. Many black soldiers returned from war to find that the same nation they had fought to preserve was still unwilling to treat them as full citizens. In towns across the South and North, black veterans faced hostility. Some were attacked by mobs, others were denied land, wages, or even the right to vote. Their uniforms, once symbols of liberation, could make them targets of white resentment. Still, the very fact that they had fought made a difference. These soldiers became powerful symbols in the political struggle that followed. When the question of black suffrage arose during Reconstruction, supporters pointed to the service of nearly 200,000 black men in the Union ranks. How could a nation deny the ballot to men who had defended it with their lives? Their blood had been shed on battlefields, from Gettysburg to Petersburg. Surely that sacrifice demanded recognition. For many veterans, the war was not the end, but the beginning of a new fight. They joined organizations, churches, and political movements, pushing for civil rights. They told their stories in public speeches and private memoirs. They raised their children with the memory of their service as a shield against erasure. Even in the face of violence and betrayal, they held on to the idea that they had earned their place in the American story. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the struggle for justice was only beginning. And in that struggle, the black soldier became an enduring figure, not a footnote in history, but a reminder that freedom in America had been won, not by words alone, but by the courage of those who dared to fight for it, even when the nation tried to deny them everything. The war was over, but for many black soldiers, the battlefield simply shifted. The muskets and cannons fell silent, but in their place came a new fight, a fight waged not with bayonets and bullets, but with ballots, speeches, and community leadership. Reconstruction was not simply a political era. It was the continuation of a struggle for dignity and citizenship that men in blue uniforms had already begun. From 1865 onward, black veterans carried with them something that no law could erase: the honor of service. They had fought, they had bled, they had seen comrades fall beside them under Union flags, and this gave them leverage, however fragile, in the turbulent years after Appomattox. When they returned to their homes, whether in South Carolina's rice fields, Louisiana's sugar parishes, Tennessee's hills, or the crowded neighborhoods of northern cities, they were not the same men who had left. They were seasoned, disciplined, and united by shared sacrifice. These qualities made them natural leaders in the Reconstruction South. Black veterans quickly became central figures in community life. They organized schools for freedmen, protected black churches from harassment, and rallied their neighbors to participate in the new political opportunities unfolding. Many of the very first black men to hold political office in the South were veterans. They understood hierarchy, strategy, and perseverance. They were not easily intimidated, and yet intimidation came swiftly. The end of the war did not bring peace for long. White Southerners, unwilling to accept emancipation, turned to terror to reassert control. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, attacking freedmen, voters, teachers, and especially veterans. For white supremacists, a black man who had carried a rifle for the Union was the ultimate threat. He had proven that black men were not passive, that they could fight, command, and even die for principles larger than themselves. This made the uniform itself a provocation. In many towns, black veterans were harassed for daring to wear their old blue coats. Some were beaten or even murdered simply for being recognized as Union soldiers, but others wore them proudly nonetheless, walking reminders that they had been part of something greater than themselves. A living argument against second-class citizenship. Reconstruction politics reflected this tension. The question of who deserved the right to vote became the central battle of the era. Radical Republicans in Congress argued that black men had earned the franchise through their service. Their case was unanswerable. How could America deny citizenship to the very men who had preserved its existence? Opponents, of course, claimed that military service was not proof of fitness for democracy. But every veteran who stepped up to cast a ballot, to run for office, or to speak in a town hall embodied the contradiction. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, thousands of black men, many of them veterans, held local and state offices across the South. Some entered Congress itself. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. senator, filling the seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. This was not symbolic, it was revolutionary. The men who had once been enslaved, or who had fought to end slavery, now sat in the very halls of power that had been built to exclude them. Veterans often led these political breakthroughs. They were accustomed to discipline, to speaking before groups, to following orders and issuing them. They became sheriffs, state legislators, mayors, and school superintendents. In many places, they were the backbone of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, in the Reconstruction South. But their power made them targets. Across the former Confederacy, violence escalated. The Klan and similar groups sought to destroy Reconstruction governments through assassinations, riots, and intimidation at the polls. Black veterans, because of their visibility and their defiance, were often first on the list. Reports from the era tell of veterans dragged from their homes, lynched in front of their families, or murdered in cold blood as warnings to their communities. Yet even under these threats, many refused to back down. Veterans organized militias to defend their towns from white mobs. In places like Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, black militiamen, many of them Civil War veterans, took up arms to protect their elected officials from being overthrown. Though the Colfax Massacre ended in tragedy, with scores of black men killed, it demonstrated that these veterans were willing to fight once again for freedom, even after the official war had ended. The federal government at first supported them. The Reconstruction Acts, the presence of Union troops in the South, and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments gave veterans hope that their sacrifices were not in vain. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, explicitly prohibited denying the vote on the basis of race. For black veterans, this was vindication. Their bloodshed had helped to rewrite the Constitution itself, but hope and reality often diverged. By the mid-1870s, Northern interest in Reconstruction began to wane. White supremacy surged back as federal troops were withdrawn. Many black veterans, who had once held office or organized militias, were left exposed. Some fled north, others fell silent, and many were killed. Reconstruction collapsed under the weight of violence and political compromise, leaving the promise of freedom unfulfilled. Still, the memory of these veterans endured. They had proven, in their own time, that black men could stand as equals on the battlefield and in the halls of power. They had shown courage, not just against Confederate bullets, but against the continuing war of racial hatred that followed. Their children and grandchildren inherited that memory, even when laws and violence sought to bury it. The Reconstruction era was both triumph and tragedy. It was the moment when black veterans of the Civil War transformed from soldiers into statesmen, from fighters into community leaders. It was also the moment when America once again failed to honor its promises. But for those who lived through it, the struggle itself carried meaning. They had not fought in vain, because they had left behind a legacy of courage that could not be erased. When we think of Reconstruction today, we often think of it as a brief experiment that failed. But to the black veterans who shaped it, it was a battlefield worth fighting for, a continuation of the war for freedom they had already begun. Their uniforms may have grown tattered, their muskets long put away, but their spirit carried forward into the long, unfinished struggle for equality that defined the rest of American history. The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but the battle for freedom did not end in 1865. For black soldiers who had survived the smoke of battlefields and the trauma of war, the end of slavery was supposed to mark a new beginning. They had worn the Union blue, fought under the stars and stripes, and shed blood to ensure America's survival. But the nation they saved was not eager to embrace them as equals. By the 1880s, a dark shadow began to fall across the South. The promises of Reconstruction, political power, schools, land ownership, and civil rights were being stripped away piece by piece. What had been won on the battlefield and defended during Reconstruction was now being dismantled through laws, violence, and intimidation. This was the rise of Jim Crow, and at the heart of its oppression lay an unspoken warning. Black men who had once carried rifles for the Union must now be put back in their place. For veterans, this betrayal was personal. Many had believed that their service gave them a claim to permanent respect. They had been the living embodiment of the Union cause. Yet in towns across the South, their uniforms became dangerous reminders of defiance. White supremacist groups singled them out. A black man who could say, "I fought for this country," posed a direct challenge to a society determined to erase black dignity. One of the cruel ironies of this period is how often veterans were targeted. In Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana, reports emerged of black veterans being lynched for attempting to vote, own land, or simply assert their rights. These men were not anonymous laborers. They were known in their communities as soldiers. men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with white comrades. That memory was intolerable to those who wanted to construct a narrative of white superiority. The legal system reinforced this betrayal. Southern states rewrote their constitutions to deny black men the vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Black veterans, some of whom had risked their lives to secure the 15th Amendment, found themselves told they were unqualified to cast a ballot. The irony was bitter. A man who had stormed Fort Wagner or held the line at Petersburg was now declared unfit for democracy. Still, veterans resisted. Many joined fraternal organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic (GAR), a Union veterans group. In the North, black and white veterans often marched together in parades, preserving at least some memory of unity. In the South, black GAR posts became safe havens where veterans could gather, share stories, and remind one another that they had once fought for something larger than themselves. These gatherings were not just social, they were political. Black veterans used their collective voice to demand pensions, education for their children, and recognition of their service. Some even testified before Congress, arguing that the government owed them more than symbolic gratitude. Their persistence bore fruit. Thousands of black veterans eventually received federal pensions, money that supported their families and gave them a measure of independence in a hostile world. But independence was fragile. White supremacists feared armed black men, and they worked to strip veterans of the very weapons they had once carried for the Union. Laws were passed limiting black gun ownership, an early form of systemic disarmament aimed squarely at those who had proven they could fight back. This disarmament was not coincidental. It was a deliberate effort to neutralize the very men who had once defended freedom. The image of the black veteran became a paradox in American culture. On one hand, patriotic speeches occasionally acknowledged their sacrifice. Monuments erected to Civil War heroes sometimes included their names, though often buried in the fine print. On the other hand, the dominant narrative of the war began to shift. The so-called lost cause myth painted the Confederacy as noble and slavery as benign. In this retelling, black soldiers were erased entirely, as though their service had never happened. This cultural erasure was devastating. Textbooks in Southern schools described the Civil War as a fight for states' rights and glorified Confederate generals. Black children rarely learned about their own ancestors who had fought in blue uniforms. Instead, they grew up in a society that told them their people had been passive recipients of freedom, rather than active agents who seized it with courage and determination. And yet, within families and churches, the memory endured. Black veterans passed down stories to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the truth survived. In small towns, people remembered the men who had come home in blue coats, even if history books ignored them. Oral histories preserved tales of bravery, sacrifice, and betrayal. Some veterans even lived long enough to see their grandchildren fight in another war, the Spanish-American War, and later, World War I. The continuity was striking. The same nation that denied black Civil War veterans equality would call upon their descendants to fight again. In this way, the Civil War veterans became part of a longer lineage, stretching into the 20th century, of black men who fought abroad for freedom they were denied at home. For historians today, the records are clear. The marginalization of black veterans was no accident. It was part of a deliberate effort to rewrite the story of America. By erasing them, white supremacy could pretend that freedom had been granted by Lincoln's hand alone, not seized by men who took up arms. By silencing them, the myth of black inferiority could continue unchallenged. But fragments of truth remain, in pension records, in photographs of weathered faces wearing Union medals, in letters preserved by families, and in the graves of men who once marched to the sound of drums and bugles. These fragments whisper a counter-narrative, one in which black veterans are not forgotten footnotes, but central actors in the making of American freedom. As Jim Crow hardened into law and custom, the veterans aged. Many died in poverty, their sacrifices unrecognized, but their legacy lingered in the hearts of their children. These descendants carried forward the belief that America's ideals were worth claiming, even when the nation betrayed them. That belief would fuel future generations, from the Great Migration to the Civil Rights Movement. This is not the end of their story. It is the bridge to the 20th century, when new voices would rise, echoing the same demand that the service of black Americans in uniform must be matched by the rights promised in the Constitution. The story of black soldiers did not end with Appomattox, or with Reconstruction, or even with Jim Crow. It continued, reshaping each new struggle for equality. The story of black soldiers in America is not confined to battlefields or military rosters. It is not merely a tale of muskets at Bunker Hill, bayonets at Fort Wagner, or rifles at Appomattox. It is a story of endurance, of how courage on the battlefield became fuel for generations of struggle beyond it. From the Revolution to the Civil War, and into the turbulent centuries that followed, black veterans carried more than scars. They carried a vision of America as it could be, rather than as it was. When the Revolution ended in 1783, men like Crispus Attucks and thousands of other black patriots were already being forgotten in the rush to enshrine white founding fathers as the architects of liberty. Their descendants knew the truth. Freedom had not been won by one race alone. Black men had fought at Lexington, Yorktown, and countless unnamed skirmishes. Their legacy planted seeds in the national soil, even if few were willing to water them. By the time the Civil War erupted, those seeds had grown into a determination that could not be denied. The nearly 200,000 black men who donned Union blue uniforms were not fighting for abstract principles. They were fighting for their families, their children, their own bodies. They proved, in fire and blood, that they were not merely laborers or chattel, but men of valor and vision. Yet their service was only the beginning. After the war, when Jim Crow laws strangled democracy and terror reigned in the South, black veterans became a hidden backbone of resistance. They knew how to organize, how to lead, how to fight back when necessary. They brought those lessons into their communities, their churches, their schools. Even when stripped of weapons, they remained soldiers at heart, strategists in a new war for equality. This quiet, steady resilience carried into the 20th century. Children who grew up hearing stories of their fathers or grandfathers fighting for the Union carried that memory into their own struggles. During the Great Migration, when millions of black families moved north and west in search of opportunity, the memory of military service became a point of pride. Veterans of the Civil War were sometimes photographed with faded medals pinned to their coats, reminders that their families were tied to the nation's deepest sacrifices. And when World War I and World War II came, their descendants carried that same spirit overseas. Black men fought in France, in the Pacific, in Italy, in North Africa. They returned with the same expectation their ancestors had after the Civil War, that service would be matched with citizenship. And once again, they were betrayed. Segregated units, denied promotions, limited opportunities, and racist treatment in uniform reflected how little had changed. Yet their determination echoed the same principle, to fight for a better America, even when America did not fight for them. By the mid-20th century, the memory of Civil War veterans had not disappeared. In fact, it became part of the language of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the unfinished work of Lincoln and the Union cause. Protesters sang of freedom, echoing spirituals once sung by the United States colored troops. Veterans of World War II inspired by stories of their grandfathers in Union Blue, became some of the earliest foot soldiers of desegregation. Even in politics, the legacy lingered. Thurgood Marshall, the grandson of a Civil War veteran, carried that memory with him as he fought to dismantle segregation in the courts. Activists in the NAACP and other organizations reminded America that black people had defended the flag in every war the nation had fought. From the Revolution onward, their service became a weapon against the hypocrisy of segregation. How could America claim to be the land of the free when it consistently denied freedom to those who had bled for it? Monuments, too, became battlegrounds of memory. For decades, Confederate statues had dominated Southern towns, while black veterans were forgotten. But by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, communities began reclaiming that history. Memorials were built to the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, to the black sailors and soldiers of the Revolution, to Buffalo Soldiers, and to countless others who had once been erased. These monuments are not just stone and bronze, they are corrections, belated acknowledgments that black sacrifice was always central to America's story. What makes the story of black soldiers so powerful is not just what they endured, but how they redefined the meaning of American identity. They proved that being American was not about ancestry, but about sacrifice and service. They challenged the myth that freedom was a gift bestowed from above. Instead, they showed it was seized, defended, and demanded by those most denied it. And yet the story remains unfinished. The struggles black veterans faced, discrimination, denial of rights, violence at home, still echo today. Modern veterans of color sometimes find themselves repeating the same lament, voiced by Union soldiers after 1865. We fought for freedom abroad, but where is it here at home? This continuity is sobering, but it is also a source of strength, because each generation can look back and see that they are not the first to face betrayal, nor the first to rise above it. The line stretches unbroken from Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, to the United States colored troops at Fort Wagner, to black veterans standing tall under the shadow of Jim Crow, to civil rights marchers invoking their legacy. The question for us today is not whether they mattered, because history shows they did. The question is whether we will honor their legacy, not just with monuments or speeches, but with justice. Whether we will finally make good on the promises they bled for. Because the story of black soldiers is not simply history, it is prophecy. It is the constant reminder that America's ideals have always been carried on the backs of those the nation least wanted to recognize. It is the challenge to every generation to ask, who gets to be called a hero, who gets to be remembered, and who gets to be free? The Revolution gave them a place at the beginning of the nation. The Civil War gave them a role in saving it. Jim Crow tried to erase them, but their memory endured. And today, their spirit remains a living force in the fight for equality. They were not footnotes. They were not side characters. They were the beating heart of America's long unfinished struggle for freedom. And the final truth is this: when we speak of liberty, justice, and the cost of freedom, we must speak their names.